Well, hello everybody, and welcome to your Chapter 1 and 2 Big Thoughts lecture. My name is John-Etienne, and we will quickly just go over some of the big points that I'd like for you to pay attention to during these two chapters. So just by way of beginning, I'd just like to read the University Land Acknowledgement. So as we engage in remote teaching and learning today, I'd like to acknowledge that the Saskatoon campus of the University of Saskatchewan is on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'd also like to recognize that some may be attending this course from other traditional Indigenous lands. I ask that you take a moment to make your own land acknowledgement to the peoples of those lands. In doing so, we're actively participating in reconciliation as we navigate our time in this course, learning and supporting each other. So I'd like to just kind of give you a very brief definition and kind of overview of the history of psychology. So when we're talking about psychology, we're talking about a discipline that's concerned with behavior and mental processes and how they're affected by an organism's physical state, mental state, and external environment. The thing that makes psychology different from just, for example, intuition would be that it's based on the scientific method of inquiry. And we're going to talk a lot more about that next week. Because of this too, or another, I guess, kind of component of psychology, is that it contains several complementary perspectives. So there's many different ways that we can kind of come to psychological conclusions. And so we look at things from biological, social, learning, cognitive, affective, cultural, and developmental perspectives. This is also very similar to the ideas of levels of explanation, but not only that, also to the idea that there are kind of sub-disciplines that help to influence psychology as a whole. And finally, that psychology places a high value on empiricism, on being able to study something as objectively as possible, which we'll talk a little bit about more next time as well, because one of the big questions is, can we actually study anything objectively? Now, one of the things for us that's important to consider is what is psychobabble? And psychobabble is this term that we sometimes use for things like pseudoscience and quackery that's covered by a veneer of psychological and scientific sounding language. We live in the era of psychobabble. There are so many different people out there that promise that they're using things that are rooted in psychology or whatnot, or neuroscience to do things. And the problem is that they're not, and they are making much money from people by, well, really through kind of making things sound sciencey but actually not being so. You know it's psychobabble if it promises an easy fix to life's problems, and one of the big things is that it plays on scientific illiteracy. Using sciencey words and actually knowing science are two different things, as we have really seen over the last 18 months as well. So scientific illiteracy is one of the things that we want to address a little bit in this course. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week, but I want to set some foundation for it. Finally, psychobabble is also fueled by popular opinion rather than by research evidence. Just because Jenny McCarthy says that autism can be cured by massages does not in fact mean that Jenny McCarthy is right. As you can see, I might hold some strong values or beliefs about that, but again, these beliefs for me are based on research evidence rather than just the endorsement of someone who is popular. Anyways, again, we'll probably talk about that a little more next week, but again, just want to set some of the stage for it. Now, one of the ways that I want you to test this out this week is on Top Hat, I've posted a file called Psychology or Pseudoscience. And what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to go and just answer the questions. And they're true or false questions, and I'd like for you just to kind of see what your score is on it. Now, many of the things on those questions are things that in psychology we kind of take for granted as that we have found facts for. But in popular opinion, there are different answers for it. One of my favorite things is this. Are psych wards and prisons more rowdy on a full moon or not? Psychology or pseudoscience? You decide. So take a look at that. I'd love to see your comments about this in the discussion as well as we kind of look and see and kind of suss out, I guess, some of the psychology and pseudoscience. So in psychology, there are several major schools of psychology. Psychology had a history of starting out of philosophy, right? That is its birthplace. And so out of philosophy came psychology. And psychology and philosophy kind of went through this divergence where philosophy said, we're going to use logic to figure out what the answer is to things. And psychology said, yeah, we want to use science. So that's where psychology and philosophy kind of split off. There are still many areas of overlap. But from that, when psychology became its own discipline, it started with this idea of structuralism. And structuralism came out of the first psychological laboratory that was opened by Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. And the structuralist approach was basically that we wanted to find what are the basic structural elements of the psychological experience. So if you wanted to know what it's like to eat an orange, what the structuralists would get you to do is use introspection. So they would get you to tell everything from the moment that you've picked up that orange to looking at it to smelling it to eating it. And so they thought that if you could identify these basic structural elements for how something happens, then that would kind of lead to knowledge of why people act the way they act. Now, the problem is that this kind of approach is a very subjective approach, and it's focused a lot on internal behavior. And you and I know that behavior isn't something that's just happening inside of us, it's also something that happens out there. And so the other part of it too is that structuralism kind of forgot that some conscious processes that we do are completed unconsciously. When you hop on a bike, you're not busy thinking to yourself, okay, so I've got to balance with my left foot, then I've got to push off on my right foot, and then while I'm in here, kind of busy pedaling, I've got to keep on pedaling, and then I've got to make sure I don't veer too far to the left or to the right. None of us do that. That would make us crazy because that's a conscious process, but we've done it so many times, it's completely unconscious to us. In the same way, if I asked you how to solve a math problem, you would probably have a difficult time telling me all of the steps that you take to get there because it's something that becomes unconscious to us. So this was one of the big problems for structuralism and really shot it in the foot. Which led then to this idea of functionalism. Well, if we can't understand the structure of something, maybe we can understand the function of it. And this also shifted psychology from being a European thing to now being a North American, and really, to be fair, an American thing. So William James was the first guy who kind of started this approach, and the goal was we wanted to understand why animals and humans have developed the particular psychological aspects they currently possess. So Darwin's theory of natural selection and fitness came into play here in a very big kind of role. But even this way of trying to decide why people are the way they are had its own set of limitations. Some of them were that it wouldn't focus on aspects of things that didn't have a systematic origin. Not everything that we do seems to come and originate out of a particular system. And also, the other part was that they couldn't operationalize this idea of the unconscious. Now, you and I also know that there are unconscious processes that happen. Sometimes we do things or react in ways that we did not consciously mean to do. And so the unconscious is an important aspect. Functionalism couldn't really capture it. So, we went on from there to go and figure out other ways of doing things. The other problem with functionalism is that as a theory, it was very cumbersome. There were easier ways to explain why people act the way they act. So functionalism kind of went the way of the dinosaur, much like its predecessor, structuralism. But out of this, there came now another reaction. And this reaction came out of Europe, and it was the psychodynamic perspective. So Freud said, look, these guys are all getting everything wrong because, unfortunately, they're not focusing on the unconscious. And so Sigmund Freud in Vienna said, we have to look at the role that the unconscious plays and how that propels behavior. Now, the psychodynamic approach was both a theory of personality as well as a particular intervention, something that we call psychoanalysis. So not only this is kind of why you are the way you are, and by the way, the answer for Freud was because of your mom. But not only was it that, but it was also a way of then treatment as well. So the problem, though, with the psychodynamic approach is that a couple things. One, Freud was really stuck on focusing on sex and sexuality as a key factor in development. And unfortunately, sex and sexuality is pretty important as a human, but it's not the only explanation of why people act the way they act. The other problem is with this theory is that it is not empirically testable. So even though it's included and has really shaped psychology, many aspects of the psychodynamic approach are not really well testable. How do you operationalize something like the unconscious? Next week we'll chat more again about what does operationalization mean and how do we do that. But one of the kind of key overview here is that Freud kind of got stuck on one thing, and the other part was that it was not particularly testable. Well, again, as you can kind of see, there's these kind of actions and reactions. So now comes another reaction, again out of America, and this was a response to functionalism and to a large degree also to Freud. So, and the response was what we call behaviorism. And behaviorism says, well, if it's not possible to objectively study the mind, why don't we just focus on behavior? Focus on what we can see. And so it kind of said that the human mind is a black box, all right? So just like in an airplane, how a black box kind of records all the data that of what happened on that flight, the human mind is the exact same way. And really what we need to focus on are what are the stimuli and the responses that are associated with that brain. Now, behaviorism is nice and neat and quite parsimonious, and it's something that we use on a daily basis. In fact, it's something that I use in clinical practice on a daily basis. But it's not without its own set of limitations. So, for example, one thing is that it is a bit simplistic. Looking at something from a purely behavioral perspective really ignores the fact that there are cognitive processes that go on in terms of how we interpret our life experiences. The other thing, again, is back to this. It still has not solved the problem of what we do about the unconscious, right? The unconscious is still there. Everybody agrees that it's the part that plays. The problem is we just haven't found out how do we integrate it well or study it well. All right, so behaviorism, still around, has shifted and shaped a little bit into different things, but again, is not the dominant theory of how we understand human behavior today. Well, from this, we then move to a strictly cognitive perspective. And so with cognitive psychology, or the cognitive school, we began to study mental processes, perception, thinking, memory, judgment, and cognitive psychology has generated a wealth of incredibly helpful literature for us. And it was very highly influenced by the development of computer systems. Basically, the cognitive psychologists, the early ones, said, well, the brain is basically just like a computer and it functions based on the same principles. And so it was very helpful, I guess, as a framework for how do we study how information comes in, how information is processed, and how information is stored and then retrieved out of memory. Now, currently, this is probably one of the most influential areas of psychology, in particular because psychology has had a really kind of a bee in our bonnet of becoming more biologically based. And so we've been looking at things like neuroimaging and all of that other kind of stuff. But there are limitations with this approach as well. First of all, the level of analysis is complete because the reality is it's not just cognitive processes that influence who or what we become. There are multiple facts that influence the path that we end up choosing, not just cognitive facts. The other problem is, and I like to call this the problem of the dead salmons should tell no tales. And I'm going to quickly just tell you about this. So there was this dead salmon study. There's a link to it in the PowerPoint. And basically these authors demonstrated that if you don't calibrate your machines properly, neuroimaging data can actually show that there's brain activity in a dead fish when there is no brain activity in a dead fish. So one of the, I guess, kind of things to be aware of is that even though we're super excited about this idea of neuroimaging and being able to see functionality and things in the brain, the problem is that even with that, what does it tell us, right? I had this discussion the other day with someone, and I said the way that we measure brain activity is in a couple different ways. One, we look at the blood oxygen content in the brain. Right? So that's things like fMRI. So we can look at where we think there's activation. But activation in and of itself doesn't tell us what is actually going on in the brain. It only tells us that we think that that part is involved in some way, shape, or form to a greater or lesser degree. Right? So that's one kind of problem with it. And then the other problem too is that in this approach, we have to somehow be able to take this data to mean something and be meaningfully applied to our clinical and our practical work. And so I put the dead salmon study in here as a little bit of a cautionary tale that even though this is a helpful level of analysis, it's not the be-all and the end-all. We still need a better way of understanding human behavior and why people do what they do. We also kind of look at social cultural factors, and this is another area that we're looking at a lot right now in psychology. And this is where we focus a lot on studying how social situations and cultures influence our thinking and our behavior. And so it looks kind of at how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others, and then how these perceptions influence how we behave with each other. And so in this section, we look at things like social norms, individualism, collectivism, all those things. But even this level of analysis has limitations. The problem is That oftentimes, if we only look at things at this level of analysis, it can inadvertently lead to just focusing too much on differences instead of on commonalities. The other problem, too, is that if we're looking at things from the highest possible level of analysis, sometimes it obscures our findings. We have to, when we're looking at behavior, when we're looking at why people do what they do, all of these aspects are important, but no one of them is really the deciding factor that leads to why we do what we do. And so, as I've alluded to it, and as you can see in chapter 1 for sure, there are these levels of explanation or these levels of analysis that are helpful for us. And so we have to understand that all of these levels are helpful in understanding behavior. And the example in the textbook in the slides is depression, right? Depression is not something that we can just understand at one level. I mean, that we do know that on a biological level that there are genetic influences that lead to depression. We know that it's connected to neurotransmitters in the brain. We know that there are kind of interpersonal factors that lead or facilitate or maintain depression. And we also know that there are cultural and social things that also facilitate who gets depression and when and where. None of these levels by themselves are the best. When we are trying to construct behavior and understanding behavior and thinking, we need to look at all of these levels. Now, some of the challenges in studying psychology is that it's a challenging thing to do. We all know, and every single one of us can think of a time that we responded differently between different situations. I may be an extrovert at home, but maybe I'm an introvert when I'm at my workplace around other people or in a new social situation, right? But one of the main things is that almost all of our behavior is multiply determined. So I'll give you an example, right? So in my work with young children, one of the things that I'm sometimes asked to do is to try and find out or to try and determine what the cause is of a child's developmental delay. Well, in the last year or so, I remember one family coming to me, and after observing their child and getting the information from them about how their child responds, one of the big questions for me was whether or not this child may have autism. Now, I didn't give a diagnosis of autism at that point in time because I wanted to collect some more information, and also I generally refer that to some of my colleagues who specialize in that. But the mom said to me that the reason why her child was the way he was is because during the age of 2 and 3, both her and her husband had to work a lot, and therefore they weren't able to pay enough attention to their child. And so I had to say to the mom, like, that can influence behavior, but also we have to look at some of the other factors. We also know, for example, that autism, tends to you can exhibit symptoms very early on, but for many children, they are identified after the age of 2. Right? The mom could have said to me, well, maybe it was vaccines that caused it. Well, again, the last vaccines that the child would have gotten would have been around 18 months. So again, around that age 2, that's when we begin to see or identify autism at a more successful rate than when kids are younger. So the mom could have said, well, maybe it's because of this. Now, we know that vaccines don't cause autism, but again, we have to look at the fact that there are all of these possible factors here that could have influenced this outcome. The other thing that could have been very helpful is, if there was a history, for example, of autism within the family, then we can say, okay, well, there's a genetic component here too, right? There are many different possible causes for why this child could have began to exhibit autism at that particular point in time. What I'm trying to, I guess, express is that no behavior is just simple to say this simple thing is the only thing that caused it. Unfortunately, as humans, that's our tendency. We want to reduce everything to the simplest possible denominator. And many times in life, behavior is just not simply reduced to only one factor. There are multiple factors that lead to why something is the way it is. And this is part of the thing that makes it challenging. To go back to the idea of autism, right? In order to study why certain children are more likely to be diagnosed with autism as to others, right now we're looking at things, everything from, are there dietary factors? Are there medical factors that were pre-existing before, a child was born that would have made that likely? One area of study right now is the role of things like acetaminophen or Tylenol in the progression of developmental disorders. Right? So the problem is that there are many different factors that could lead to it, whether it's genetic factors, whether it's social factors, whether it's, all kinds of things. So multiply determined behavior makes studying psychology a very challenging thing. And again, this whole thing about the unconscious, many things happen outside of our conscious awareness, and it's important for us to recognize the role that the unconscious plays in determining behavior. We will touch a little bit more on that as time goes on, because it is a helpful area for us to study and to chat about. Now, those are all kind of, I guess, the big things that I would like for you to kind of point out or have you thinking about over this time. But again, go work through the textbook, work through these things. As you come up with questions, put that in the discussion board, and let's see where this week leads us. As always, if you have questions, get in touch. Otherwise, have a great week studying and learning psychology, and we will talk soon.